Today, I will be talking to you about there's a lot of ideas out there about ocean based solutions. We hear a lot of blue economy language out there. And oftentimes in these conversations, aspects of equity and inclusion are not really part of the conversation. So, one way that I propose that this could be better addressed is if we really start to talk to the communities that are facing these impacts already. So, centering communities that are at the margins. So, today I will be talking about mangroves, Priscilla, from a very different place, but mangroves are here. And yeah, I'll move on. So, first, I'll say I'm going to share stories about a community, and it's very broad community. But I also want to point out that even within communities, there are different people that, based on their gender or age or education level, class, they face environmental change differently. So I just wanted to point that out. And starting with this quote from Vera Medaor sorry, the text got messed up, but and it says, poverty in mangrove communities has the face of a woman, and it's a conchera. A conchera is a mangrove cockle collector or gatherer. So I'll be talking a lot about them today. So just wanted to start out centering them. Um, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people know what mangroves are. I just thought I'd leave this slide here just in case. One of the things that I do want to point out is that mangroves provide a lot of ecosystem services. There's one of the most productive forests in the world. And specifically in more recent decades, they've been giving a lot of importance because of their carbon sequestration capacity. So, more and more, when we talk about climate-based solutions, mangroves are really a part of the conversation, whereas just a few decades ago, they were considered wastelands. Not much could be happening there. So, again, just to provide some context and where I come into this conversation is some of the blind spots in blue ecosystem assessments. So, with the blue economy language, is anybody who works in ocean anything hears all about the blue economy, and it's been presented as a tool for helping make informed decisions, right? And oftentimes, though, it doesn't really. These types of assessments don't really provide a holistic view of ecosystems. So some of the areas that I'm really interested in as an ethnographer is, for example, cultural ecosystem services. So sometimes you might think, well, some of that cultural aspect or non-material dimensions of ecosystems are incorporated in fisheries or tourism. But for example, when it comes to tourism, that's really still based on outsiders and not necessarily the communities and their perspectives. So just kind of like, there's a lot. I'm trying to just present a big story here. But more recently also, we have now, we're in the decade of ocean science and sustainable development. And there's really beautiful language in these reports. But one of the things that I was wondering about is, it talks about this idea of like they want to identify transformative ocean science solutions for sustainable development and connecting people to our ocean. But my questions are like, what about people whose lives are already very intertwined with the ocean? And what can we learn from communities that have really long-standing, multi-generational relationships with ocean and marine ecosystems? So that's the story that I'm telling today based on my ethnographic work. So the stories come from Ecuador. Continental Ecuador has 5 mangrove regions, and each region has communities that are culturally very different from one another. But at the same time, as a collective in the country, they've taken this name where they call themselves the ancestral peoples of the mangrove ecosystem. So the specific community I'll be talking about, I'll show you a map in a minute, is a community in northern Ecuador. So I just wanted to put this out here. If you have questions, we can chat more about the methods. But essentially, I am an ethnographer. I rely a lot on talking to people and qualitative research, very unapologetically. I love it. So I can share more about these methods, but I just wanted to show you kind of geographically where am I talking about. So this is a community that's very representative of a lot of coastal communities in Ecuador, where they're rural for the most part. And there's in some of the more rural communities, there's not a lot of livelihood diversity. So a lot of people really rely on whatever jobs they can get. So here I just have a representation of some of the jobs, like small scale agriculture, very, very small scale fisheries, a little bit of tourism, construction, and a lot of women, for example, cooking food. But in this community in particular, like in a lot of mangrove communities in Ecuador, a lot of the communities really rely on conchas or mangrove cockles. And they were, until the 1980s, they didn't have a lot of commercial value. Before that, they had a lot of value for communities. But as they started to gain commercial value, it became a source of livelihood. So the people who gather cockles are called concheras or concheros. And here's just some photos again of what this job looks like for people. So there's a lot that I could talk about, like the relationships here, but I wanted to just highlight some of the ways in which, yes, this is a source of livelihood, but beyond that, mangroves for these communities are more than what we think of, ecosystem service providers. So the first thing I'll say is that this practice is a multi-generational cultural activity that historically was practiced by women, and it had the knowledge of how to do this practice was passed down by women. So a lot of the children would go with a mom or grandmother or aunt, and this is how they learned how to engage in this practice. However, like I said, in more recent decades, it went from a subsistence practice to a livelihood practice. People talk about how it's access to plata caliente, or like hot cash, like cash in your pocket. So it's really just, if you need money, you can go to the mangroves, you're going to have money. So this is especially important for women. I'll mention this later, but women have not had access to wage labor. So this practice allowed them to be able to make some money. So here's just some of the quotes, like this woman saying that her grandma and her mom tell her that this is how they maintain their families through the mangroves. So mangroves provide access to both informal and formal education. A lot of these kids that go from a very young age, sometimes as early as like 2, 3 years old, which is crazy because I have a 2.5-year-old and I could never imagine taking him in this space, but they've been going from very early on. So they really learn a lot about the mangroves from going with their family members. But also outside of informal education, they also provide access to education in general. A lot of the people talked about how through this money, they're able to pay for their schooling of their children. And for women, that's very important. And they feel very proud that they're able to do that. But also sometimes the kids, they go for fun. But even though they're doing it for fun, they collect these cockles and they're able to give them to their parents, who then commercialize them. And then in turn, they're providing a source of income for the family. Women, again, there's so much and the gender dimension is very big here, so I'm just trying to put it into a couple of slides. But in reality, it does mean something different to the women because of that source of economic independence. So like, for example, there's women who talked about being in abusive relationships, and they were able to leave a partner who was being abusive to them because now they have a source of income. So again, there's so much importance that women have tied to the mangrove. But in general, it also supports just their well-being, including mental health. So a lot of women talked about how they don't have any time to socialize, but when they go to the mangroves, they're able to socialize, but at the same time, they're also working, so they're not wasting their time because God forbid they have fun. But this is a really important thing for women. So in this quote I have here, this woman was saying that sometimes she's very stressed and she goes to the conchas, that's what they call it, going to the mangroves, or las conchas, and there's so much tranquility and this air just brings her back to life. So not just for women, but in general, the community, there's a big sense of pride as to what the mangrove ecosystem means to them. So here's just some quotes reflecting that. The first one was actually by a man who said that the mangrove has given so much to the community, and they all recognize that this is like an honor that they have. And he said it's like a national flag for them. The women, it gives them an identity outside of being like a housewife or a mother. They also can say, I'm a conchera, and that's really important to them. And this other woman who actually had retired from the practice due to old age said that even though she no longer was going, she still remembers and she sees those mangroves, and it reminds her of how important she is because those mangroves gave her that identity to be able to call herself a conchera, allowing her to shine as a conchera. So this is a poem which I don't find myself particularly artistic, but I created this found poem based on all my interviews. So this is text that I gathered from my interviews to create this, and I feel like it really holistically represents what the mangrove represents for people. So I'll read it to you all. So the mangrove represents our life and that of our children, of the future we have in front of us. The mangrove has life. It gives you strength and energy. We return that life with care. We enter it with love because love is what makes us take care of things. In the mangrove, I feel like I'm at home. I come and I go as I enter and leave my house. I feel such tranquility there. It's where I feel free. That's why the mangrove is my life, my everything. The moment we enter it, it's like finding our mother. You can go carrying all these problems, and the mangrove hugs you. It takes away your hunger and thirst, it takes away your anxiety. Because we see the immensity of the mangrove, we have faith and certainty that it will help us resolve the problems we're carrying with us. In the mangrove, I see my father, my mother, my family, my ancestors. I will always be a part of the mangrove. So you can see that this is really a deep relationship that people have with this ecosystem, and they feel like it's very important to them, as you can imagine. So switching gears to conservation efforts, this is actually a reforestation day. This is an abandoned shrimp pond. I'll talk about shrimp farming in a minute. And I want to just capture some of the conservation efforts that have been taking place in this part of Ecuador. So mangrove forests, again, they're very important for carbon sequestration, but they're also some of the most threatened tropical ecosystems. So global decline for mangroves, it's estimated to be from anywhere from 30 to 50%, but realistically, it's probably higher now. It's a bit of an older statistic. But there's a lot of pressures that are leading to mangrove deforestation, coastal development, economic activities. But one of the largest drivers of mangrove loss is aquaculture, industrial aquaculture. And specifically, something like 38% or something like that can be attributed to shrimp farming alone. So here's just some pictures of shrimp ponds when you're entering the community. They're surrounded by them. So this is just a brief image from Google Earth, and you can see the town is very small. It's about 550 people, and the footprint of the town is almost as big as some of the shrimp ponds. That's how big the shrimp ponds are. This is just the southern part of the Muisne River estuary. This is again in southern Esmeraldas, and it's estimated that mangrove decline in this estuary dropped about 87%. So quite dramatically. And all of this land cover changes for these little shrimp that are actually not consumed by the community. They are for export. So there's a really kind of crazy history with mangrove conservation in Ecuador. But to just kind of get you to the point that I need you to be at, is that in 1999 at the country level, they allowed communities to be able to apply for mangrove concessions. So until this time, specifically in my field site, in the 80s is when shrimp aquaculture was introduced, and a few years later, people started to fight back. They were really upset about the deforestation that was happening. They saw how it was affecting their lives, but there was not much they could do about it until 1999, when suddenly communities could apply for mangrove concessions, and then they could establish what that use would look like. So in the context of the mangrove river estuary, for example, different communities and groups of fisherfolk associations, like concheras associations, mostly they were women at the time, they were the ones that were the custodians of these spaces. And what they established was these types of extractive reserves where the mangroves were protected, but it also guaranteed their access to their spaces. So when I ask people like, well, what is your function in the ecosystem? Or do you consider yourself a part of it? They would say yes. And I would ask, what's your function? Predominantly people would say to take care of it. So here's just some of the examples of the actions that people take to take care of mangroves, like stopping deforestation by reporting illegal logging, for example, or talking to the shrimp farmers and convincing them to do things in sustainable ways or in more mangrove-friendly practices. They also talked about like educating other people. In the past, especially, they employed rotation systems, but as there's less and less mangroves, it becomes harder to establish good rotation systems of where they gather cockles. People talked about not taking small cockles when they can, keeping them trash free, but especially they talked about deforesting degraded areas. So a lot of the women talked about how in the 90s they began to reforest mangroves, and how the men thought they were crazy. And people were like, I've never heard of this. This is like the stupidest idea. But then when they saw that it worked, all the men were like, wow, this works. So they started to see that if they could reforest them, mangroves could come back. So in 2014, again, there's a lot of history with mangrove conservation in Ecuador, but in 2014, something specifically happened, which is that there was introduction of a conservation project called Socio Manglar. It's a partner, the partner mangrove mangrove partner, and it's based on this bigger project that had been established for some time called Sociobosque. And there's this idea that you can create partnerships for conservation, and I really do like their logo because it's like you're partnering with nature, right? So the biggest things that the plan would entail is restricting the expansion of industrial activities, but it really was focused on educating the public, providing economic incentives, and limiting access to the mangroves. So as you can maybe imagine, that became problematic. So this is not my photo, but this is just a photo I found from a newspaper, where this is the first recipients of incentives from the Socio Manglar project in the southern part of Ecuador, where it was first introduced in 2014 again. So it was presented as this win-win, everybody wins strategy, where you're now able to have access for conservation projects that historically have not had access funding for, such as mangroves, that are very historically were very little funded in Latin America, but especially in Ecuador. So it became this really effective climate mitigation strategies, very much based on the RED model. If people know about reducing emissions through, oh my God, through deforestation and degradation, yes. So again, based on this bigger model of providing incentives, the idea is people will care about conservation of forests if we provide them incentives to care for them. So they really were, this project in particular was really focused again on engaging in partnerships with the communities. The government would create these partnerships, then the communities would take care of the mangroves. And they also said that there'd be a lot of other alternative benefits, such as alternative livelihoods, ecotourism, and basically was presented as a really good strategy. But in many communities, there was actually huge opposition to Socio Manglar. So in this picture, you can see this is a shirt that the Conchera was wearing, where in their mind, they're comparing mining, something so destructive like mining, to this conservation project. So they said that the reason they were against it is because they really didn't see this as a local benefit. They saw this, that it was going to exclude people from the mangroves. And the really biggest problem is, in particular in the place where I did my work, is there was a Conchera association. That's who the government approached for this partnership. They needed an organized group. When they said no, literally the next week, there was a new group that said, we're also an association, we're going to make one. And not, anyway, it was mostly led by men. But it really created a lot of division in the community, and there was, like, to some points there was almost conflict happening where people were physically fighting and hitting each other because of these conflicts. So the problem with a lot of these top-down projects is that they really don't pay attention to what communities want, what they need, and what they have to say. So here's just some examples of how the community's perspectives have been erased. So first of all, again, I'm just trying to introduce, there's a lot more I could say, just don't have time, but people have taken care of the mangroves and they feel very proud of that. For a while they didn't. They allowed the shrimp farmers to come in, but now they have. And now their efforts have been erased. It's as if no one's ever done anything. And people also talked about they don't want a privatized mangrove, they said. They want a free mangrove. This person was talking about how they recognize this as a benefit, so they want they said, we ourselves should be the ones to take care of it. This other one gets deeper at that. It says, I wouldn't like if someone else, specifically they said an outsider, came to protect them because we wouldn't be a part of the mangrove anymore. So there's this idea that if you come in and you start taking care of my mangrove, now I'm no longer a part of it. That's how they saw it. And people said about, we should just be conscious that we need to take care of this ecosystem without being paid. People talked about how they would do it for free. They've been doing this for a long time. People talked about, like, it gives them life. And I'm going to run out of time. So anyway, someone said about, like, why should we be paid to take care of the mangroves? And this person was saying that when they came and told them about this project, they're like, why are you going to pay us? Like, what are you really wanting out of this partnership? So what I'm trying to show here is that there was historically, there was a relationship people had with this ecosystem. When you bring in a project that provides incentives, it starts to change that relationship. It's no longer about that connection that people have. Now it starts to be driven by money. So just to summarize a lot of this, again, sorry, I want to do it. It's just meant to be a conversation starter. But now to kind of wrap it up and bring it back to this idea of how do we create more equitable and inclusive practices. So Um, a lot of these ecosystem assessments, again, I'm not saying that they're bad. I just think that they are not holistic. And I think that qualitative research can provide sometimes insight into those blind spots that these ecosystem assessments are not able to grasp. Um, I think that we need to create not just disciplinary approaches, but inter and transdisciplinary approaches. And we really can't, everyone can do everything. You cannot have multiple PhDs in multiple fields so that you can do these projects on your own. I think it's really important that we rely on collaborations, and not only with academics, but it's really important that we figure out ways to engage in collaborations with the communities themselves. So I loved your idea of presenting research to people. And I come from a place where there's a lot of science communication is a really big part of like the training I've gotten, but we also need to listen to what communities are telling us. So our job is to talk to them, but part of talking also should be listening. So the local community members are they're ecosystem beneficiaries that need to be a part of these conversations. They also have a lot of knowledge. They may not use the language that we use, but it doesn't mean that they don't know what they're talking about. We need to bring them in and respect them as equal knowledge holders, just like we are. And we need to understand really like why these relationships exist and why people think the way that they do. Because when we ignore these types of narratives, we could create really poor unintended consequences for people. Like, for example, when shrimp farming came, I don't think anyone thought that it would lead to maybe higher rates of domestic violence, but it has. So, we're not thinking about these things. We need to understand how these ecosystems provide benefits for communities so that we can make better decisions. And the last thing I'll say is I think it's important that when we engage in these conversations, we really think about like what is being included, like what is like do an inventory of what is actually being included so that we can see like what is not. I also think it's important to think about who is being included, and not only who is being included, but how are they being included. In this project, they were presenting it as a community partnership, but the community needs and their voices were not actually being heard. They were there for the pictures, they were a checkbox, but they haven't historically been actually heard. So it is really important that we think about, these communities are at the front lines of climate change. They're the ones that are going to be bearing the impacts before any of us do. So how do we actually show up, provide them access to resources and information, and empower them so that they can protect themselves? And it doesn't result in bigger problems down the line. So that's it, and thank you.
Explora más contenidos de tu interés. No olvides suscribirte a nuestro canal.